Cheers, gents.
Cheers.
Well, I can honestly say what a unique year it's been. It's been a very strange year. It's been an increasingly positive year, I think, for the industry. All of my sort of cynicism and fears of a bubble have been roundly quashed during this edition of the live tour. I suppose my first question is, where do you think we're at?
I think, in terms of the year past, it obviously started off pretty rocky with us being in a lockdown, but everyone knew that the market was buoyant at that point. We'd just come off 12 months without any shows, and still the market was buoyant, and which led us to believe that there was going to be the bubble that you were speaking about. As you say, it seems like the overwhelming feeling is positive. New builds are doing well, brokerage is doing well, charters doing well, and therefore everything that comes underneath that is doing well. I don't think I quite share your positivity in terms of there not being any threat moving forwards. I think the buzzword for me, certainly over the last 12 months, but certainly over the last 3 or 4, has been capacity. The brokerage market is saying there's not the supply anymore to meet the demand. Everyone except the new build yards is saying they're going to reach a bottleneck in terms of capacity with a lack of subcontractors. And then there's issues like the raw material costs increasing. To paint it in a more positive light, we are seeing more new entrants to the market. People have either got off the fence for one reason or another. So we're in the rudest health that I've ever seen the market be in, but that doesn't mean there aren't challenges ahead. So I think we have to temper our optimism with a bit of realism.
I think to be honest, I wouldn't expect anything less, Raw. The cautious optimism is probably about as optimistic as our business editor Rory Jackson can get. I suppose just before we look sort of positive and we look ahead, Jack, you've obviously written fairly extensively about some of the issues that still pervade the industry. Mm-hmm. Operationally, we still face challenges, don't we, in terms of professionalism, in terms of supporting the guys that drive the engine room, literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, and I think everything, it's a cliche to say that the world's changing quickly. Everyone always says that at all points in history, but I think it's genuinely true now. Things are moving really quickly. The perceptions of our industry regarding professionalism are changing. There's more of a lens on us now, which puts an impetus on us to lift our standards. There's a transparency now, and we've come up short in quite a few ways. The mental health survey that we published recently, and many of these factors, all speak to that narrative that although things are booming, everything's great from a manufacturing standpoint, from an ownership standpoint, the options on the table for the owners are fantastic. But yeah, we need to make sure that everything else kind of rises with the tide as well. I think that's really important.
I think because I've got you on camera, I'm just going to start pinging some questions your way. Ultimately, we started this project in September. It was an unknown quantity. I think it's fair to say we've all been surprised by the quality of the conversations we've had over the 3 series up to now that we've done. What have you taken away from your conversations, both of you, during this TSF Live quarter, I guess?
I think from my perspective, and we spoke about it when we did our roundup after Monaco, I think it's proof that the industry is stuck in the same cycles in terms of the way it talks about itself, whether that comes from the marketing rhetoric, whether that comes from the press releases. It seems like there's far too much plug and play discussion. So, Monaco, for instance, every press conference was exactly the same content, same conclusions. And we actually ended up speaking to a number of those individuals at the show, on camera, as part of the live tour. And the amount of brilliant information that we got as a result, and how intelligent and how on the ball these people were, it just shows that the information the industry has, without revealing anything that's NDA'd or particularly personal, there's a lot more to give in terms of showing the world what the industry is actually all about, and showing that it's not just an industry for flash people buying high value luxury assets. It's actually an industry that's growing organically and through investment more recently, and that the professionals within it are exactly that, professionals. I think from the outside it looks a bit like hobbyists, and we've seen very well-known people in the industry when they talk to general media and people like that just going for really, really surface level opinions and not really delving into it and exploring the stuff that we actually find the most interesting. So my favourite part of this process has just been getting the chance to sit down with people and have proper conversations rather than relying on the, as I say, the plug and play information that tends to be fed out into the industry and to the wider markets.
Well, I think to that point, Rod, I almost feel like sometimes the term super yacht has become wrapped up in its own connotations that draw out all these kind of misconceptions, these antiquated ideas. As soon as you say the word super yacht, it's tied to this old way of thinking, this old way of presenting the market and presenting the reality of what the yachts are. And of course there is a certain side of it that gets that gets too much attention and gets too much kind of emphasis. But the word itself is kind of wrapped up in that now, and I think what we've seen is that when you look at it beyond the term itself, there's a lot more going on, and I think kind of divorcing it from that old kind of misconception, I think is pretty important.
I mean, Will, just to throw you in the lines then, what have you got from the process and what have you found to be genuinely useful, or not?
I think, to be perfectly honest with you, and it sort of echoes a bit what you said, I feel there's still a tendency among certain, not necessarily sectors, I wouldn't group it by sectors, but potentially factions of our industry to try to control the message. I actually think the message they're trying to control is both ignorant and naive, and actually only serves to hamper this industry.
I was going to say, do you think that's detrimental to the growth?
Well, and have they had control over that messaging for a long time?
They have. I think, obviously, as a sort of as a journalist through and through, I've always found it unbelievably frustrating that some of our competitors essentially indulge in a race to the bottom, which is essentially acts a conduit for corporate communications. That's incredibly frustrating. I think what we've been able to achieve with this series is to identify and to showcase the individuals and organisations who are innovating and willing to change this market for the better. And I hope that we are providing a platform for them to do that.
Do you think, in a sense, the market needs to start practicing what it preaches? I mean, we've had so many discussions, and people talk about how the message has evolved from specifications and toys to values and experiences, and I still feel, to a certain extent, that what we say and what we do is slightly different. We've spoken to a number of people from around the world that have genuinely interesting locations that are accessible both by private and charter vessel. And then we've had communications with the stakeholders there who have said things like, I spoke to a bunch of charter brokers in Fort Lauderdale who didn't realise they're even able to send the yacht there, which begs the question, we're selling this global industry where the possibilities are endless, but actually what we're putting in front of the client is what we've done up to date. I know there are certain businesses out there, but they're in the minority that are pushing boundaries, and I think that's a brilliant thing. I hope more people will get hold of this, but I think to a certain extent, because of knowledge gaps within various factions or sectors, I don't think we're actually presenting the full scope of what is achievable through ownership, either out of, I'm hesitant to say ignorance because it's a very strong word, but equally I don't want to say laziness, but I feel like there's a knowledge gap. I don't think even the people within the industry, and I count ourselves among that, because we do so many projects where we speak to people from all over the world, and they're like, are you aware that yachts can come here and they can charter here? And we're like, no, because no one speaks about it. And I think whilst it certainly happens, as I mentioned, I think there is a lot of education to be done, and if I could almost go back on my previous point and say that capacity was my big concern, I'd almost argue that education was of a greater concern for me.
But with the bottleneck, like you talk about, like the often, beaten up on sector of the industry is the brokers, and saying, are the brokers conveying this message effectively? And I think to a certain point, they are the pointy end of the spear, right? Like we can talk about this and we can come up with all these fantastic solutions, and we can have it perfectly, conveyed and communicated. But at the point of signing off on these contracts, which underpin our entire industry, there's only a certain group of people in the room, and is that the bottleneck that kind of is the point that we need to convey?
I'm not sure that it is, because I think it's everyone. I think it's the journalists. I think it's the brokers, the charter brokers, the shipyards. But also, I think there's a need for the various associations and the locations themselves, if that's what we're still talking about, to actually get the message out there. I feel like people always expect that if they have a good product, that people will just come to them, and we know that's not the case. I mean, we've seen fantastic shipyards struggle because they haven't been able to practice what they preach, or they just haven't been, even though they've got a good product, the way they've approached things have been wrong. And I think in terms of the growth of the industry, one classic example is people talking about a lack of marina capacity, and everyone's basically talking about Europe and the Fort Lauderdale and the Caribbean and those kinds of areas. There is so much possibility for this lack of capacity with marinas to expand and grow other areas, and it is happening. And I appreciate that infrastructure projects take a great deal of time and a great deal of effort, but people are so focused on worrying about capacity in certain locations that they're not looking at creating capacity in arguably more interesting locations.
Yeah, I think for sure, and I think an interesting point for me from an operational perspective is I often think that there's a misconception in the industry about how much time owners want to spend on board their boat and marinas. And with this idea that, well, without the marinas, the boat's not going to go there, which is categorically not true. And even when there is a marina, there are a lot of owners select to not be in the marina. It's great to have the capacity, it's great to have the facilities. Often see marinas built with, the investment group gets Gucci and Ralph Lauren to build a store there, because obviously the boat's going to sit there with the owners on board and they're going to spend money at the shop, which I've never seen. Never seen the boss walk off the back of the boat, spend 10 grand, walk back on. But yet, again and again, we see these huge infrastructure developments that are predicated on the idea that, Field the Dream style, if we build it, they'll come. They'll come regardless. Marina is an additional kind of bonus for a lot of these destinations. And sometimes I think there's an ecosystem in the industry that exists that's perhaps not grounded in what owners actually want to do and what they want to experience.
I mean, we've certainly seen it through our consultancy work, is that projects are brought to mind, or products or services, and it's often based on assumption, as you say. The owner's going to come and he's going to spend 10 grand on Gucci or Ralph Lauren or whatever it may be. And we've worked with a number of clients who've come to us and said, well, this is what we want to do. And we've always tried to impress on them that there needs to be a period of research to work out, is that what the client wants you to do?
Who stop and actually ask, it's not built on, and I've never seen, I say this, spending most of my life in the shipyard industry, but I can't imagine there's many other industries where this amount of capital flows and this amount of investment happens without due diligence.
Yeah.
Without saying what actually is going to happen here. Things tend to get built, Entire marinas, entire infrastructures get built. And I feel like often it's not underpinned by any real data.
I mean, you segued beautifully, Jack, into maybe one of my 2021 frustrations. We're bringing back the new build report, and while I don't want this to be a plug, because by the time people see this, it'll be well underway. It's a massive frustration of mine is still the lack of understanding around the sharing of data. We've had umpteen people on stage at various incarnations of the Super Yacht Forum outside our industry who are chucking serious money at this industry, and they bemoan the lack of transparency and the lack of data. And yet still major players have this nigh on archaic view of data sharing. I mean, for me, it's a perennial frustration. I sort of struggle to understand it.
That's like we said, well, like we've spoken about before, though. A lot of the industry, there's a lot of an older generation in the industry whose employment is predicated on safeguarding little bits of this data, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure it's even that though, because I feel like people think they're being exclusive by
Yeah.
being
Yes.
private, but they don't realise they're holding on to data which, in isolation, no one actually cares about. So, using the new build example, knowing
Yeah.
how many deliveries someone has, unless you have none, that's not damaging. It's not. Everyone knows, because we're an industry that knows. We're a small industry. We already know that data. All we really want is for you to clarify it, so we can present it in such a way that it can be used by people either from within or from outside the industry to actually improve it. I mean, something we've talked about before is ownership data. And I'm not talking about who are they, how
Yeah.
old are they,
It's a
what are their
no
jobs,
interest.
how many
Yeah.
kids they
Yeah,
got.
yeah.
I'm talking about if you have a delivery, if you say their nationality, suddenly we can start coming up with some really interesting metrics showing what nationalities of people go where typically,
Yeah.
what size are they building. And all this is usable when you overlay it with the stuff that already exists. But for some reason, there's this ridiculous notion that if someone told us what nationality someone was
Yeah.
who owned a yacht,
Yeah.
the world would stop or the industry would collapse. When it's simply not the case. And if we want to find out what nationality they are, we can know. Everyone knows. We can just ask the people off the record who owns that or where are they from. And without almost bar none, we get told. But if we presented it in such a way where you couldn't even tell which shipyards were associated with which nationalities, people just pump the brakes completely because they can't see the value in it. And it's not till we can prove the value of it by getting access to that kind of data that we'll be able to change anything significantly. So, I mean, my hope for the future is that people become a bit more savvy and a bit more intelligent in terms of what data needs to be kept private and what data can be used effectively.
because there's that certain subject of data that everyone basically has access to. It can only be chopped and changed in so many ways, and doesn't actually provide that much insight. You know, it's all talking after the fact about yachts that were contracts that were signed 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, well, you're trying to, look back in time and think, well, what could we have done? You know, and it's not actually that insightful, but there seems to be a huge sector of the market that just all bickers over this same data pool, chops and changes it, repackages it, and I'm not sure who it's for. I'm not sure what purpose it serves. Whereas, like we said, there are certain nuanced data sets that it's not to write an article. It's not to poke and pry or encroach on anyone's privacy. It's just to really understand, where the market's heading and how we can be better.
Yeah, I think you guys have summarised that issue very articulately, and I think it is a perennial problem. I suppose that before we get everybody to switch off, because we do bang this drum a lot. You strangely, Raw, mentioned some sort of positivity and some outlooks. So
Never.
I'd be interested to know, both of you, what you think. What are your expectations for the year ahead?
I think based on what everyone said, I mean, we've talked about the demand both across new builds, brokerage and charter. It cannot be understated how brilliant that is. It's excellent. The fact that people want to engage is the most positive thing to come out of this year. Whether or not there are capacity issues, etc., which there may well be with certain yards or with certain places, I think the fact that people want to engage with yachting more shows at least that some of the messaging has been working. Now, the way how we break up that new activity can be in so many ways. It could be, is it the benefit of being financially exploding throughout the pandemic? Is it the fact that the pandemic proved you can spend extended periods and work remotely, and so can your team? Is it that people want it to be a safe haven? I'd argue not. But there are so many reasons, but any way you spin it, more people want to engage with the market, and that cannot be a bad thing. Now the challenge is just for the market to rise to that and make sure that the quality levels remain at the accepted standard, which is excellence or above, and that all the stakeholders within the market ensure that the experience, whether that's buying the yacht, chartering the yacht, operating the yacht, and everything in between, is also excellent, because we know there are holes there at times, but slowly I do think the sort of peaks and troughs in terms of the quality that's available is softening out. So I'm looking forward to it, and I think the industry's in a really good place, but it's our role to try and make sure that the positive momentum keeps going by occasionally being negative or being cynical or pointing out where fault is, because talking again about market reportage, there's been articles we've written in the past, for instance, that have been negative. but they've been very fair. People have made serious mistakes where lives have been at risk, where large sums of money have been lost, and the market adopts this attitude where you shouldn't do that because it makes us look bad, whereas what really actually makes us look bad is we don't fix the problems and they keep happening. That is more damaging than someone trying to educate or improve. So I think support from the industry would be my big message moving forward in terms of trying to help us lift the standards, because that's what everyone really wants.
Yeah, no, I think that's summarised really well that side of the market. I think for me, bringing it back to kind of my area of experience, which would be operations, is, you know, there's been some pretty rough reporting recently also around the reality of life on board for crew, and I think there's that oft-repeated cliche that you know, a terrible boat with a great crew is a great experience, but a great boat with a terrible crew or an unhappy crew is a terrible experience. So it becomes downstream of that no matter how well we build the boats or how, you know, the most amazing locations, if the crew aren't happy, the experience is bad by and large. And what we've seen recently is there are a lot of unhappy crew, but we've also had a lot more accountability and transparency back onto that side of the market, and there might be some tough conversations ahead, but the important thing is that the conversations are being had. And if we can start seeing working on board and operating yachts as being another career path with easily transferable skills that you come in and out of, as opposed to being this thing you go and do and you put up with it, I think we can lift that experience and by and large lift the experience of the guests, because that sometimes we also forget about that. The whole thing is about the happiness of the crew and the happiness of the guests.
More importantly, Will, what is your outlook?
It'll be 11 years next year, and covering this industry, and I can safely say I've never been more positive about the future. 10 years ago, there were absolutely zero conversations in this industry about the environment, about diversity, about inclusion. Now that they may sound like soft topics, but ultimately the first one, the environment, drives the potential investment in our industry from a new generation. The other two are about a meritocracy, which has been markedly absent in this industry in every sector, with the exception perhaps of manufacturing, those artisanal skills. There has been a focus on profiling people because they are potentially of a certain class, of a certain sex, a certain age, to the detriment of that company's performance. It's been ultimately suboptimal. It is finally improving. It's nowhere near where it should be, and there was some really legitimate questions raised at our recent forum in Amsterdam. But for the first time, I genuinely feel like we're moving in the right direction. And for me, that's a massive positive. And I suppose because it's been quite a long few days on the beers, and we're almost out of beer.
I was going to say, we're going to have to refill.
We're nearly there, yeah.
But
I just suppose I'll conclude by asking you both. Raw, you wanted to pose a question to everyone on this leg of the tour, which I really liked, which was their New Year's resolution. I think as two journalists, what should the industry's New Year's resolution be?
For me, and I've touched on a lot of points which I consider to be of great importance, but I think the element of education and miscommunication or knowledge gaps is huge. I mean, when we were at the Super Yacht Forum, I think it was Cordy Rover spoke about the fact that he had learned stuff from below deck about in terms of designing crew accommodation on board or crew spaces. To me, that is baffling. I think it's great that he admitted it, but I'm sure he's not the only one that could stand to learn a lot. I think there's too much assumption in the industry, and so my major plea, if you will, or resolution would be to base your decisions on research. And then because if you need to know how to change crew living spaces, you need to speak to 100 crew members or something to that effect, and you need to ask the questions to the right people. I mean, there was a raft of concepts, legitimate, some of them that came out years ago, that had no research or backing, and they've absolutely just disappeared. These are companies that wanted to bring something to market because what they were doing was not based on any sort of research, empirical or otherwise. So my resolution for the market would be base decisions on information, not assumptions, because I'm not going to use that old adage, but it's true.
Yeah, no, I think mine would be similar to Raw's, but perhaps a little more specific in the way that I would ask that everyone thinks about the words that they use. Yeah, like it's not a case perhaps whereas you could speak to this 10 years ago, words are thrown around like sustainability, like diversity, like inclusion. They mean something now. And even a generation before, we didn't hold each other to account. With coming transparency, the rest of the world will, and we should, you know. So if you're going to say something sustainable, what do you mean? If you're going to say you're going to be inclusive or diverse, what do you mean? You know, and I think that's something that I think, yeah, if we can bring that back and really focus on what do these words mean that we're saying, because we'll join you with that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll hold you to account, and please hold us to account.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really important.
And what about you, Will?
Just to sort of build on my pet project and passion is essentially hire people on merit, be it on board, and most crucially, shoreside, hire people on merit, because this industry has so much untapped potential because we're looking for polished boys in deck shoes or
mumble suits.
Very pretty girls. It is irrelevant to what someone can do and how they can perform for a company. I would love to see more companies hiring people because of their ability.
Yeah.
And I think it will change everything for the better. On that note, I'm absolutely parched.
Yeah,
I was going to say cheers to that.
So it's been an absolute pleasure.
It has.
And it's 2017.
Cheers.
Oh, that's bad luck, isn't it?
Bad luck, but we'll
Ah.
that's right.